Chapter 22. That is enough. After it all, I'm falling apart, and I don't want to be put back together, but you're putting me back together anyway. Jennifer woke up in the early morning, gasping for breath. She sweated profusely. She mechanically turned her head to her alarm clock, which read 7:21 a.m. She coughed, covering her mouth with her hand as she slowly rolled out of bed, striking the ground. She slowly pulled herself up, using her side table to support herself. Her joints trembled, filled with searing pain. Her bones to her felt as frail as thin glass. She pulled herself back on her bed and leaned forward, taking deep breaths. She felt like her chest was caving inside, the lungs bursting out at the seams of her ribs. She took numerous measured breaths. She now felt at equilibrium. She leaned backwards, still breathing heavily with her hands rested on her chest. She looked up to the sky outside her window. The sun beamed down on her, glimmering with shadowy clouds rolling in. She eased up on her breathing, and she felt her shortness of breath was stable, but her bones still felt like glass. She pulled out her cell phone and opened her email. Her fingers trembled as she rapidly typed up an email to her work to let them know she was sick and couldn't come in today. She went into her contacts. She scrolled down to Dr. Korovitz. Her thumb trembled. She clicked the green call icon. She clicked speaker as the phone rang. She placed her phone on the side table. It rang and was answered quickly. Dr. Nikolai Korovitz's office. This is John. How may I help you? Hi, John. This is Jennifer Miller. I'm one of Korovitz's patients. I woke up with a shortness of breath and I feel exhausted and my joints are in searing pain. I woke up like this in the morning. It was sudden. Is there any way Dr. Korovitz can see me today? Half a moment, Jennifer. Jennifer could hear the typing away rapidly. What is your date of birth? 8/2/89, she answered. Click, clack, click, clack. He has an opening at 9 o'clock. Please, she said. See you at 9 o'clock. Jennifer sat in the waiting room in the clinical office. The office was empty this morning apart from a man sitting in the corner, waiting for his turn to get into the office. John, the receptionist, was typing away on his computer, making notes on appointments for the doctors in the office. She waited patiently, still feeling weak in the legs. She crossed her arms over her lap as she stared ahead, concerned with whatever was going on with her body. It was all sudden. She had shortness of breath before, but not with this severity. Jennifer? Jennifer looked up and smiled at Dr. Korovitz. The doctor had a thick Russian accent and bright brown hair in his full lab coat. Yes? I will see you now. Jennifer trembled as she stood up from the floor. Pain seared into her joints, and she put on a smile as she stood up. Korovitz frowned as he looked at her. He took her hand as she approached him, and he led her firmly to his patient room. She took a seat on the bed, and he took a seat on the stool, logging into his computer. How are you feeling? He asked in a soft voice. I'm in pain. This morning, I woke up with a shortness of breath. By itself, it isn't unusual. However, this wasn't usual. It was far worse, and it hurts my chest. I feel like my chest was going to collapse. I barely made it back to my bed after I fell off. My bones, particularly my legs, feel like glass. She grimaced, letting her tears stream down either side of her eyes. I've never felt this way, at least not with this severity. He started to take her blood pressure. Is this the first time you woke up like this? Yes, was all she managed to say. Ease up on that arm, he instructed, his eyes angled at the machine, as if trying to piece together an age-old mystery. He wrote down the blood pressure. Blood pressure is fine. Nothing to worry about there. He took a needle out and he drew her blood. I'll be back. He placed a bandage on the spot where he drew blood and left her inside the empty room. She wiped her tears with her hand. She took deep breaths. She felt a vibration in her pocket. She took her phone out of it, and she received a text from Ted. Tedward, I wonder how you're doing. That was a serious breakdown or breakthrough last night. I don't know what kind of pain you're going through, but it seems you and I will suffer together. Perhaps I'm being overdramatic. Yeah, that's it. I'm fine. She opened the text message. Good morning, Jennifer. Words cannot express my feelings. Sometimes I don't understand them myself. Do you want to come and feed ducks with me by the gardens? She sniffed, smiling at the text. She returned it quickly. I don't know yet, Tedward. I would certainly love to. Can you do me a favour and call me later? Whenever you get off work tonight, I'd really appreciate it. Immediately, he returned the text. I'll call you after 6 p.m. She smiled. He was certainly quick to return a text, a swift response, and a response with utmost certainty. She had no doubts within her heart that he would call her at that time. She wiped more tears from her face as she put her phone back into her pocket. The door swung open. Korovitz took out a medical document and handed it to her. She looked over it. While much of it was a lot of medical jargon, there were some things she did recognise. These were the results of her blood test. Her CBC was alarming. 3. Her eyes opened wide as the document trembled in her hand. "We need to get you to the hospital. Did you drive here?" Yes, she stammered. "We'll get the necessary call in place for a biopsy to be certain, but it's possible you may be developing leukemia." Korovitz took her hand. "Are you okay to walk right now?" "Yes," was all she could say. Leukemia. He took her hand. He led her out of the patient room and led her down the hall, leading her through the vestibule and down to a chair in the waiting room. He went back behind the door. Korovitz went behind the receptionist, saying something to him inaudibly, who started typing away and sent something to the printer. She sat. Her eyes trembled in front of her. She held back her tears, but her hands betrayed her feelings, for even the receptionist noticed the anxiety fueling her. Wide eyes as the pupils trembled, streaming down reluctant tears and her uncontrollable quivering. She leaned forward, frowning into her trembling hand. She took another deep breath and buried her face in her hands and spoke into them, muffling her words to God. "Lord, forgive me. I don't think I've faltered. I don't think I have, but perhaps I've been caught up with Ted and paid too much attention to him and not enough of you. An innocent mistake by our standards down here below, but you are a perfect God and our standards are not yours, and by yours I've made a fatal error. I'm sorry. I've escaped death before, twice. If it is your will, it will be a third time, but if not, I understand. I've had one too many second chances already. If it is your will, I accept, but please let this not be my time. Just please let me have a little while longer. Perhaps I haven't been as faithful as I think I have. Perhaps this is my fatal error. Lord, remove the calluses from my heart. Please, please, please." Jennifer woke up from the anesthesia, finding herself in a white room while sitting up. She looked out the window. The sun was setting. She looked around herself, seeing the nurses and physician assistants walking back and forth, attending to various patients. She looked around to see if she could find her own pants and her phone. She looked carefully, trying to find something to tell the time. She knew she wouldn't have the results from the biopsy for another 7 to 10 days. There was no use trying to worry about it. She found her purse sitting by the side of the bed. She couldn't reach it. She looked back up and moved her braided ponytail off to her left shoulder. She looked for a free nurse and waved her down. The woman moved over to her swiftly and gave her a warm smile. Jennifer looked at the woman's name tag, catching only the last name, McCurdy. "Hi, miss, could you tell me what time it is?" McCurdy looked at her watch. 5:47, she answered. "Oh, really? I guess I woke up just in time. Could you hand me my purse? I can't reach it, and I'm not sure if I should be moving around much yet, but I'm expecting an important call." McCurdy reached the side of Jennifer's purse to her. "Thank you very much. Would you happen to know when I'm to be discharged? Let me find out for you. Do you have someone to pick you up?" "Not yet." The nurse walked from her into the other halls. Jennifer looked at her phone and saw no notifications just yet. It wasn't like she received texts very often, especially not on a Wednesday. She scrolled through her contacts. She went to Sam's number and texted, "Please pray for me. I woke up ill. I'm being tested. Pray that it's negative." There was silence, except the constant walking of nurses, the rolling of wheelchairs, and the constant stamping of crutches and walkers. There was constant rolling of various machines filled with oxygen and other medical accessories. She waited as the time passed by, waiting for that call. She was certain he would call, despite the constant efforts of distancing he kept putting between them. She was certain that he really wanted to talk to her, even to discuss something mundane. Perhaps he'll finally reveal something else not traumatic about himself. She heard the imaginary clock ticking inside her head, like a little lost dwarf hammering away at her cranium. She looked down at her phone, still waiting for any kind of response from Sam, while she still waited for Ted's call. Her notifications remained empty and silent, as the sounds of the hospital drowned out the ticking of her internal clock. She looked back out the window, staring at the streetlights outside, illuminating the streets, which was still filled with lots of pedestrians, walking around with their phones to their ears or their faces bowed down and typing or reading away aimlessly in them. Many others, children, seemed happy to be skipping along in the street with their parents, skipping away like little children. Many of those children were tugging on their parents' arms for attention. She couldn't help but smile. She She looked back to the end of her bed and looked at her feet. She wanted to know and feel if her bones still felt like breaking glass as they did this morning. She sucked in the air through her teeth, anticipating pain as she lifted her leg up, taking the cover underneath them. Her left leg trembled as it rose, but not so much from the pain, but rather with the anticipation of pain. Her leg was growing defiant of her condition, however severe it may be. She put her left leg down and rose her right leg, which trembled as it rose. She smiled and put her leg back down. Buzz. She looked down at her phone, smiling as Ted's name shone across the screen. She swiftly answered the call and brought it to her ear. "Tedward!" Her tone was filled with excitement as her lips rose from ear to ear. "Jennifer," he spoke. His tone was not cheerful, nor did it seem grim or depressing. It was just there, empty. "Tedward!" she exclaimed yet again. She smiled through the phone, not because of the empty monotone, but simply because his tone wasn't cheery. This time, he wasn't trying to hide anything. "Are you feeling okay? I mean, the other night, that was a lot to process. It couldn't have been easy." "Well, I suppose I've seen worse," he replied. "It's hard to say I've seen much better times in my life, but perhaps that was for the best. There's just only so much I can say. I think we've all had our trials and faults. I think that it is not all you," she said, dropping her smile as she saw the nurse walking over to her. "I think part of it is on me and Samantha. We did push hard on you when we had no right knowing anything, but we didn't want to see you alone. I recognize a fake smile, and while some fake smiles fade well into the crowd, yours stood out to me. I don't blame you. I don't. I find it difficult to express myself, even when you annoy me. Well, it was bound to happen. I annoy a lot of people. It is one of my quirks." "You mean charms, don't you?" His tone was playful. "You can be discharged if you have a way to get home," the nurse said to her. Jennifer nodded. "I suppose it is one of my charms. You haven't ditched me yet, have you?" "Discharged?" he asked. "I'm in the hospital for a biopsy. I'm about to go home, somehow," she explained. "Nothing serious, I hope." "Did you drive?" "No," she answered. "I was delivered here by ambulance. My car is still at the doctor's office." "Are you okay?" he said. Even over the phone, his voice was monotonous and seemed uncaring, but he was trying. She knew, otherwise he wouldn't have called. "I'm sure I'll be fine. Hey, here's an idea. Why don't you pick me up and take me home? Sam's not getting back to me." "Where are you?" "The diseased manor," she answered. There was silence on the other line, and then he laughed. "There is no hospital with that name." "We can make it one," she joked, smirking with one curve of her lip rising higher than the other. "Sure, so where am I picking you up?" "Jameson's Hospital, 32nd Broadway, Brookline. I think I'm on the 4th floor," she replied. "Okay, I'll drive over. Give me about a half hour. I'm coming from Dedham. I'll see you soon." Click. She looked back down at her phone, seeing a text message from Sam. "I will pray. Sorry for getting back so late. Work troubles. I hope you're doing well. Brunch on Saturday? Michael and Tim will be there. I don't want to invite Ted back just yet. I think he needs some time." Sam smiled down at the text, feeling accomplished. Not that she had Ted all to herself for the night, but the fact alone that he spoke to her without masking his emotions so much. For tonight, maybe he will completely remove that mask. Perhaps, finally, the iron heart was being softened, capable of being adjusted by a hard mallet. She texted back, "I think I'll pass on brunch this week. I'll see you Sunday." Jennifer leaned back and looked up to the ceiling, placed both hands beneath her. She let out a deep breath, sighing into the air as an indescribably heavy burden was violently lifted from her chest. "Lord, be with me," she prayed. She closed her eyes and crossed her hands over her chest. "Lord, thank you for the gift of modern medicine, and thank you for Dr. Nikolai Korovitz and his insight in catching this. I am content. Thank you for pushing me through my limits, through my dreams and aspirations. Forgive me, Father, for even though I fall constantly and fail to follow your laws, please humble me when I am consumed by arrogance and pride." She opened her eyes at the room. She took a deep breath and tried to move her legs again. This time she could move both legs up and down, and she did so, taking turns, not grimacing with any discomfort, for it seemed to have subsided, and she smiled. "Thank you for everything. Truly, I am grateful. I have more than enough and more than I need. Thank you. Amen." Ted walked through the doors into the hospital. He smiled as he walked in. No one here needed to know his true condition or his true hatred. He noticed many people in wheelchairs, some amputees, many whose faces were void with sunken eyes, long and skinny faces, devoid of all personality, just like they were completely dead inside, much like himself, only they stopped caring enough to hide it from anyone. He smiled at the thought, being dead inside. If only his heart would stop beating. He went to the receptionist, waiting in line, still scanning the busy hallways and the busy white floors smeared with feces and urine just waiting to be cleaned up. A staff member dressed in white, wearing gloves and a mask, came by with a wet floor sign and a mop bucket and started mopping away. "Sir, sir, hello, is anybody home?" The annoyed receptionist called out. Her spectacles hung by her chest with grey beads. Ted jerked his head to her, catching a very unforgiving but friendly face out of the corner of his eyes, his fist clenched at his side as he removed his frown with a bright smile to the much older woman. "Sorry about that, my mind seemed to have slipped. Careful, or you will end up sleeping too. How can I help?" "I'm sure. I'm actually here to pick up a patient, Jennifer Miller." "What's your name?" "Ted Anderson." "I don't see your name here." "Embarrassing," he chuckled nervously, as he was sure was the appropriate response. "I just got the call to pick her up. She does know me if you want to call her down. I'll take a seat somewhere." The older woman motioned to him to sit in a chair which was vacant. "Thank you." Ted went and took a seat on the chair, waiting, and scanned the room. He continued to scan for the man he saw, the unforgivable man. The man still had that buzz cut, that sinister smile with his dog tags hiding underneath his lab coat. The man looked like a seriously joyful man, smiling cutely at other women who happened to walk by as if encouraging niceties. "Dr. Adams, are you really a medical doctor? It sickens me to think that you could actually care about people. I certainly never received such treatment from you. Not after you strapped me to that damn chair in leather straps, sending electrical currents all through my body until my pain receptors no longer worked. Adams, if I wasn't trying so damn hard to live a normal life, as normal as I can, despite my own psychological deficiencies that you caused, I wouldn't hesitate to kill you." Dr. Adams disappeared as he continued to walk down the end of the hall. Ted knew who and what it was that he saw, and frankly, out of all the painful memories and people in his past, he was sure this was real, and he wasn't merely having a psychotic episode in the end of the day. Ted's hands relaxed as he pressed them against his pants, still scanning the hospital. He didn't feel safe here, not when there was a familiar face present, well, one that wasn't Jennifer's. For all of the things he knew, and it pained his heart, her smile, the least of all, was genuine. He took a deep breath as he stared down the vestibule with a little nurse pushing a wheelchair, and in that wheelchair was Jennifer, holding her purse on her lap. She smiled as she waved her arm at him. She had a light blue medical gown over her clothes. He smiled at her, breathing deeply as he stood up from his chair. He forgot abruptly that he just had a faint encounter with someone from his past, however one-sided, as Dr. Adams didn't appear to recognise him. Of course, why would he? It was 8 years ago when he last saw the bastard of a doctor. He turned his attention back to Jennifer, walking to meet the nurse. "Hi, Tedward." She smiled, that fox-like smile of hers. There was something suspicious but beautiful about it. As always, like she was playful, her eyes were half opened. "Elizabeth." He gave a light smile. "Well, is Mr. Darcy reading up on his Jane Austen for me? How romantic." The nurse giggled behind her. "You got her?" "I'll take her." Ted went into the back of the wheelchair to push her along. "Onward, the chariot awaits." She rose both her hands and kicked out her feet. "Whee!" "Well, I can't say I've had to be in a hospital before, but I don't think I would be in good spirits." Ted chuckled, pushing her out the door. "Tedward," she leaned back into her seat as she looked up at him from below. Ted noticed her watchful eyes, watching him. He can't say he understood her true intention, but he felt vulnerable, almost like when Slithers broke him down after years of badgering to take her to go stargazing. "You need to learn to live a little. Life is too short to be miserable." She paused a moment. "I'm sorry. I know I can be overbearing at times." She sat back, all snugged in her little chair and hospital gown, as Ted rolled her over the boardwalk and carefully into the parking lot. He awkwardly smiled down at her. "I see. Well, I suppose I've lived long enough to know how short life can be. Some lives may be long, others tragically short." His tone dropped. "Ted." She looked back at him as he rolled her to his car. "I'm sorry. This isn't my way of trying to pry anything out of you. I just want your company." "I understand." He wheeled her to the side of his black car. He opened the car door. "Of course, what kind of friend would I be if I didn't desire to know something else about you?" she asked, sneering at him. She wobbled out of her seat and sat herself into the car. She smiled as she moved her feet into it. "Is the chair yours, or do I need to put it back into the hospital?" "It goes back into the hospital. There should be a little depot right by the front doors, if I remember right." She gestured back to the hospital. It's okay. I'll be here, waiting while you return it, Mr. Darcy. As you wish, Emma, he replied. Wrong Jane Austen novel. Emma was Mr. Knightley, she snapped at him, pointing fingers at his chest. Don't disrespect Jane. He snickered as he shut the door and rolled the wheelchair back to the hospital, leaving Jennifer alone as she stared out the windshield. She fastened her seatbelt as she adjusted the seat. The bones inside her fragile legs trembled as she applied pressure to the floor of the car to push her seat back. She grimaced as pain filled her joints again. She leaned her head against the window to her left as she scanned the skies, the dark clouds raining in overhead. Ted, I hope you find it soon. The storm is coming. A shiver went up her spine as the temperature appeared to drastically drop. She felt it from within the car. She started rubbing her shoulders and gazed back out the window and saw a woman walking through the street with crimson eyes, silver hair, and a youthful face as she skipped along. She seemed familiar of a sort, someone looking for adventure, or so she thought. The girl disappeared behind a crowd, gone like a wisp. The door on the other side opened. She sharply turned her head as Ted moved into the car, buckling his seatbelt. All right, Jennifer, let's get you home. Where did you leave your car? It was at the doctor's office. I'll pick it up for you. He put his key into the ignition and started the engine. Ted drove out of the parking lot into the street and started driving through the heavily congested roads of Boston as they drove towards the Seaport district. Jennifer moved in her seat, thinking about the tears Ted shared that night, on the night she would remember, the 4th of July. She was certain he had every intention of wearing that mask, living in the facade of his own life, forgetting everything else that was important to him. This constant reminder of his condition she found most curious and shameful of her own compulsive obsessiveness over him, but she couldn't not think about it. But does he really have anything important to him? Then an image flashed through the back of her mind, walking in the darkness of the night, the quiet stillness of College Avenue when he broke down on all fours, weeping, crying, letting all the pain leave his body. But truly, there wasn't an outlet big enough to house all that pain to let it out at once. The temperature dropped drastically that night, and light emitted in the air. An unnatural light that shouldn't have been shining. The light came directly from his body. Maybe it was something small enough to pry that he would remove a brick from that wall he keeps up. Ted? Yes, he replied, never taking his eyes off the road. That night when you ran off, she began. She noticed he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'm not going to ask your feelings or what you're going through. I'm not going to pry, but perhaps you can explain something to me that I'm having a hard time trying to understand. I saw these lights coming from your body. What was that? His smile faded, and he let out a deep sigh, keeping his eyes on the road, maintaining his laser focus on the busy road. I am the only person I know that has ever had them. I don't know where they are, but they are regrettably a part of me. I can't get rid of it. I've tried, but nothing works. I don't know what they are, nor do I truly understand what they do. All I know is that when I use this organ, the temperature drops. It's really hard to describe. I've never had to describe it before. It is like breathing, but it's something other than air. It goes into these vein-like things and protrude out of me. It appears to change colours depending on what I'm breathing in. I don't know how else to explain it. No medical doctors knew what those were either. I first noticed it was part of me during an especially difficult time in my life that I don't care to discuss right now. That is enough, Ted, she replied. He turned to her slightly. That is enough. She smiled to him, twiddling the loose ends in her braided ponytail with her right index finger. Just to admit that is enough. You don't have to explain any more than that. The fact alone that you trust me enough with that is warming to my little frail heart. I want you to know that, even while it may be unnatural, I do not judge you for it, nor will I condemn you. I just want you to know that. Thanks, he answered before turning his head back to the road, his eyes angled with a sharp frown like he made a fatal mistake. The streetlights shined brightly on the sidewalks. He parked his car in the back of the Seaport, a short walk away from her apartment. He turned the key off. I don't think I asked, but maybe we can talk in your place. Do you need help getting up? If you don't mind, Tedward, she smiled at him as she opened the door. My legs are still a little weak. Hang on. He walked hastily around the front of the car to get to Jennifer on the other side. He took her hand and carefully helped her out of the car. She moved to the side, leaning against the side of the car for support. He closed the door and locked it. He pulled her arm over his shoulders, pulling her closer to him. He held her close to him as they walked, using his strength so that she felt weightless, light like a feather. He walked her across the street and into her big apartment building. He took her up the elevator and walked her down the hall. She breathed heavily with each breath, especially reaching for her keys in her purse. She opened the door and it creaked open. Ted walked her in and brought her to her couch. "Thank you," she said, smiling up at him. "You're welcome. I've been meaning to ask you, and I don't know why I waited this long. Why were you in the hospital?" he asked empathetically. She let out a sigh and patted the cushion next to her. "Take a seat." He looked suspiciously at the cushion before cautiously sitting down next to her. She looked up to the ceiling as if the answer to some unknown question was written on it. "Life, it is so fragile and ought to be protected. No matter how worthless it might seem, no matter how useless, all life has value, and I think sometimes I feel I take the life I have for granted. It became apparent to me today when I woke up, gasping for breath like some devil was inside my chest. I am a survivor, Ted. I've survived a lot, and perhaps that's why I seem to be overbearing at times, so full of life, because I have already been on my deathbed." Ted actively listened to her, the small details, how her tone changed from sentence to sentence. It was clear to him she wasn't stalling to tell him the reason, but she still hadn't processed everything just yet. Death was something he was all too familiar with, while deathbed wasn't an alien concept to him. There were times when he thought he would be on his deathbed. Well, that was until he found out he couldn't die by normal means, it would seem. Those cursed veins prohibited it. "I called the doctor's office and had a blood test, and my doctor seems to think I have a high chance of having leukemia. I went to the hospital for a biopsy, and I did have some treatment to deal with the pain. I don't know if I've been confirmed for leukemia, that is what the biopsy is for, and if I have it, it will determine the type of leukemia I have." "You seem to be in good spirits for someone who has potentially received her death sentence," he said grimly, turning his head away from her, not wanting to look into her eyes. She took her hands and clasped them around his cheeks, and turned them to her, so she could smile that faithful smile, filled with cheer. Despite the cruelty of her uncertain condition, she was full of it. Of course, Slithers would never do this, but it was warming all the same. "This world can be a dark place. It is filled with despair and hopelessness. It is filled with tragedy and loneliness. It is filled with gloom. However, I know where I will go. If it is my time, I will gladly accept my deliverance from this world and be all the gladder because of it. I don't know where your faith lies, or if you have any in the Lord, but I wholeheartedly believe, and he gives me peace in all of this. I may be cheery now, but like many others, I will cry, but not yet. I didn't grow up in a church. I've heard telltale mentions of a God who is loving and good," he replied. "However, I find it hard to justify a loving and just God created this world with so much tragedy." "I thought the same thing once, many years ago," she sighed. "But no point in dwelling on this now if you don't want to. I'm hungry. You're not in any condition to cook." "I don't want to cook, silly," she giggled as she released her grip from his face. "What do you like to eat?" "I can't taste anything. I can't taste anything. I haven't been able to taste anything in over 8 years." "Well, that's boring," she sighed as she leaned back in the cushion. "So then, the baklava." "I couldn't taste it. I tried it and tossed the rest. I appreciate you being honest and showing me a part of you. It's like meeting a new person." "You're welcome," he said flatly. "I want Chinese food." She pointed to a brochure on her TV stand. "There's a menu right there. Could you grab that for me?" "As you wish," he replied, getting up from his cushion to grab the menu. He brought it back to her. She looked at it. "Ted, I know you said you can't taste anything, but are you hungry?" "I barely eat," he replied. "Only when necessary." "I'll order you something." She dialed a number on her phone as she stared at the menu. About an hour passed, and they sat at her dining room table, with the brown crunchy paper bags and the sturdy white boxes with aluminium handles sprawled around with some paper plates. They were filled with fried rice, chicken fingers, and teriyaki. It smelled delicious as the steam from the steamed vegetables assaulted their noses with their sweet and delicate fragrances. Ted ate sparingly. "Ted?" "Yes?" "Last night at Terry Nation, you came back there and hid away on a Tuesday night around the time we would have been there, which we were, of course. Why did you come? I don't entirely understand why, if you were hell-bent on avoiding us." "I guess you could say I was running away. I quit my job. Fortunately, I can still do that with my computer and not have to worry." His voice trailed off as soon as he realized how stupid that was. "I don't worry for money. I have plenty of it. It's much rather I worried about not having something to keep my mind occupied. I knew you all would be there. I wanted to say goodbye, to give that courtesy, but when the time came, I couldn't muster it up within myself to do it. So I tried to leave, only something else happened instead. Sam managed to find me there as I was finishing up some potatoes. Unfortunately, I'm very good at hiding my own thoughts, my feelings. I know you don't wear your heart on your sleeves, but they came out bursting at the seams last night. Ted, forgive me. I know I said I wasn't going to pry, and I guess I won't, but I do want to know a little more about what happened to you. Would you be willing to share something? I would be willing, but the question is what? A lot happened to me, and so much of it wasn't exactly legal. He let out a deep sigh as his eyes scanned the ceiling as if to study it. You see, Jennifer, I was part of this group that was part of the US Army, but the program itself was run by the CIA. They chose 32 men and women to be part of this program, of which I was one of them. I nearly didn't make the cut due to an earlier heart attack. We were all physically fit and battle-hardened by the time we started our series of deployments, lasting a total of 4 years. We barely slept. We barely ate at all during that time. For 4 years, we were up before the sun and didn't sleep until the moon slept. One morning, we'd end up in Iraq and fight a 2-week firefight. After we were done raising hell, we would go back to the forward operating base to resupply. We wouldn't get a chance to go into our barracks. Of course, we had none. We didn't need them. We'd be on the next flight immediately to North Korea the following day. Repeat, fly to Russia. Repeat, fly to China. Repeat. He stopped scanning the room, pausing briefly, waiting for Jennifer to respond. She chewed the food in her mouth slowly, peering into his eyes. She nodded her head, waiting for the rest of the story. The nations began to fear us, and rightly so. We learned their tactics and killed them in their sleep. Whenever there was a fight between America and any other opposing force, once it was known we were on the battlefield, the battle was already over. It didn't matter how many people they took with them, it was a matter of how fast they could arrange an organised retreat. He paused again, biting his index finger, and looked down to the table, seeing a speck of dust. He took his free hand and brushed it off onto the floor. He returned his gaze back to Jennifer, who looked back at him, ignoring the fact that he just wiped dust on her floor. I too value life to the highest degree, but my actions tell a different story. You'd think that after killing so much I would become numb to it. I never did. I still see the blood on my hands, and I still see the light leave their eyes. I still see their faces, and they never leave me, always staring at me like a murderer. Why shouldn't they look at me like that? He choked up as he shed tears from both eyes. His heart was on the table, and it was opened. But this time, it wasn't something that needed to be pried open. He willingly gave her the key. I didn't have a choice. I didn't have a choice. He wiped his eyes with 2 fists, twisting them about. He felt warm hands cover his and softly pulled them away from his eyes, guiding them palm upwards to the table. Her fingers caressed his wrists, and he saw she never once looked away. We always have a choice. At times there may not seem to be any good options, but there is always a choice. Seeing Ted was hyper-focused on their hands, she removed hers from atop his and laid it palm-facing upwards next to both of his. She noticed his hands trembled before they flipped, holding her hands firmly on the table, and with that she saw him with clenched teeth. His eyes turned towards her with watery eyes, shimmering from the ceiling's light. She was thankful that another layer of his facade came undone. If only he could bring it upon himself to seek help, and yet, as if some cruel fate or curse was laid upon his birth, he's compelled to do nothing and carry the burden of guilt alone. Ted, you didn't tell me everything, and I don't mean you to. He took a deep breath, sucking the air through his teeth, and let the air out through measured breaths through his clenched teeth. You're wrong. He spoke silently, and I can't tell you why. Can you tell me why you can't tell me? She asked. There was a silence. Jennifer gripped onto his wrist a little more tightly. Finally, Ted slowly shook his head. She slowly nodded, never once letting her gaze escape his, as she finally clasped his hand with her second free hand. What you've said already is enough. Like a shaken-up soda bottle, you need to release some of that built-up tension before you can open it properly, without it getting messy and blowing up all over the place. You've told me what I have asked, and I will ask for nothing more tonight. And Tedward, I want you to know that what you've told me is not going to leave my mouth nor my lips tonight, tomorrow, or ever. I hope you believe me. He nodded. She scarfed down the rest of her food. I could use a shower, but tonight has been a rough one. I think I'm going to turn in early. Good night. She turned to get up, and her legs wobbled before she gained full composure of her legs. Okay, it isn't that bad, she said to herself, hoping to use the placebo to stave off the pain. She started walking back towards the couch. Ted, you are still in your house, right? No, I sold it as soon as Sam started getting too close to me. I have an apartment in Waltham. Ted, I wouldn't normally do this, she said. But I don't want to be alone, neither should you. But I do have an extra blanket if you want to spend the night here. The couch isn't all that big, but it does pull out into a spare bed. I don't want you to be alone tonight. I'll stay. She smiled and tilted her head down as her eyelids drooped halfway down. Now, Ted, does this mean I'll see you in the morning, then? Yes, he said slowly, and his volume dropped to a whisper. She smiled as she went into the other room. Ted watched her, carefully monitoring every step. He watched as each leg shifted, and her feet turned with each passing step. They were disorganized. Tonight he felt an incredible weight lifted from upon him. It's been 8 long years, at least that's how he remembered it. Too bad, the memories won't go away. The nightmares won't stop. She came back out of the room with a large blanket already folded up, walking into the living room, placing it on the coffee table. She removed the cushions from the couch and moved them to the side as she pulled out the folded bed from the couch. She set the blanket on top of the bed and started to tuck in the sheets. There you go, she said. Thank you. He spoke softly. Good night, Ted. He nodded to her as she slowly closed the door to her room and walked to the futon. Looking down at the soft futon, he let his arms drop to his side. For once in his life, a bed was made for him, not one that he was forced to make and remake over and over again with a single wrinkle on the sides. This bed was made perfectly, no wrinkles, nothing drooping too far from one side to the other. His hand reached for the blanket. The hand trembled abruptly as it touched the blanket. Glaring, he found his hand pulled his nightmares again into his reality. His hand, covered in crimson blood, lit by the burning flames. He saw iron and stone rubble in front of him, and the roar of the flames drowned everything else out, covering his mouth as the awful scent of spilled petroleum assaulted his nose. His nightmare turned again into reality, and further smells assaulted his nostrils, burning flesh and rotting corpses and other expiring fluids. The buzzing of the flies filled his ears. He covered his nose as he reached for the futon that was no longer there. Kicking the side of the futon, he tripped over it, feeling the burning coals against his palms. Head striking the pillow, coming back into the reality that was Jennifer's apartment, and he left the flames of regret behind him. He kicked off his shoes, taking numerous deep breaths. He stared at the blank empty ceiling as he rested his back against the futon, sprawling his limbs on the unnatural comfort of the bed. We trusted you, you know, came a voice out of the corner. Ted immediately sat up and scanned the room. To the corner of his eye, he found an all-too-familiar face, someone he forgot. She had glasses on her face, and her brown bangs framed it as the rest of her hair was tied back in a ponytail. To him, she was wearing black pants and the green fatigues. Her arms crossed over each other. Roach, he said. Ghost, she said disapprovingly. Why are you here? The same could be said of you. You know why I'm here. Why are you here, trying to make a life for yourself? It was what you always wanted, wasn't it? To live as a normal man with a wife, maybe have some kids, a job, get a house, and yet here you are just as miserable as you were when you were with us. She dropped her hands and tilted her head as she took 2 steps forward to him. She sneered at him, showing him her blood-covered teeth. You should be sacking Uncle Sam right now. You know how I feel about that. Ghost, don't give me that, she snapped at him. Everything we fought for was a lie. Everything we died for. It was nothing more than a sham. There is no point in lives like ours. If you don't sack Uncle Sam, then there is no point in a life like yours. I don't want to. His eyes angled to hers, and he frowned, clenching his fists at his side. You don't want to, but you need to, Ghost. Do you want to finally lay us to rest? Her tone softened. More than anything. Then you need to sack Uncle Sam. You know what all of us sacrificed for that. Do you want your nightmares to go away? Do you want to stop seeing these vivid dreams? Do you want to end it all? I know you do, and if you do, you need to sack Uncle Sam. She aggressively pointed a finger at him. There is no point. His voice was stern. Roach, even if I did, I know that the nightmares will only get worse. There is no closure for a monster like me. It won't mean a damn thing. He gritted his teeth. Then you've given up. You don't understand, Roach. The difference between you and me is that your nightmare ended 8 years ago. I wish mine ended that day. I go to sleep and I see it all over again, and my nightmares refuse to end. Ghost, she sighed as she took a step back and leaned against the back wall. I know. We all know that you don't have the damn guts to do it, and you're the only one of us who can. She sighed as she stared at the ceiling. Well, I've got to go. This was useless. You're useless. Oh, and Ghost, don't blame yourself with what happened to us. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Ted's eyes glimmered, coated in tears again. He wept softly as he rolled his fist in his eyes. "It's not your fault I died," Roach said coldly. Ted looked at her, and he saw her as he left her. Her left arm was severed in her black uniform, her right leg was completely torn off, and the stumps bled profusely on the floor. She removed her uniform with one hand, revealing the cavity that was inside her chest. The bones were shattered inside. The right side of her face completely burned. The oil on her face still burned, and he could smell the burning flesh. He could smell the soot of blowing gunpowder. "The fault was entirely mine for trusting my life in the hands of a wretch like you. I can't believe I trusted you to be able to protect me. You can't save anyone. How could you, when you can't even save yourself?" He gasped as she shook her head in disappointment. The colour in her body and blood began to slowly fade into transparency. The silence to him was deafening, but he knew it wasn't over. The demons and monsters were about to come out. He slowly went to lay back as he started to choke on more tears. He grabbed one of the cushions and brought it closer to his head as his ears were filled with the unrelenting, agonizing screams of men and women. It drowned out his thoughts completely, as the room around him turned into a prison made from flesh and arms, and the tiles of the walls were faces, dead and dying, with eyes still lively, seeking out his face. Servicemen and women surrounded him, aiming their weapons. The screams of agony outweighed the sudden burst of gunfire. He felt the vibrations in the air as bullets passed over his head. He silently wept. His eyes filled with tears and terror as he tried to drown out the noise by squeezing his ears with the cushion to no avail. He could still hear them as plain as day. These men swore in the languages of all the people he killed: English, French, German, Chinese, Russian, Polish, Italian, and Korean. He saw every last detail in all their faces, the scars, the malformities, every last one of them. Because of him, he thought, he made countless widows and orphans. Because of him, there are families going without food. Because of him, there is going to be an emptiness in their lives, and those kids the parents left behind are going to think ill of him. And should they know who he was, for certain they would seek his head. And who could blame them? If only, he thought, there was a way to achieve world peace without needless bloodshed, he could have found a purpose for his miserable existence. Roach was right. There really wasn't a point in a life like his. Jennifer's eyes came open with a start as her ears rang with loud, tormented screams. The temperature dropped drastically, and she pulled the covers off and hopped off her bed. She opened the door into the other room, peering from behind it. The wall was filled with a light of rainbows. Tedward. She investigated the bed where Ted should be, and she found the cushions ripped from the sofa, laying to the side, and the blanket was dishevelled. Ted. She moved out from her room, dragging her blanket with her. She put her hand out in front of her to shield her from the blinding light, and she found Ted in a corner, huddled up with his knees to his chest, with multiple coloured lights emitting from his body. These lights looked like human veins, and they covered his entire flesh, from his fingertips to the top of his skull. The lights were beautiful, like a rotating rainbow. She looked at him carefully. Tears streamed down his face. Then he looked dead ahead, at nothing in particular, but as if he was in one of those horror movies and a monster just killed everyone he was with, and he was next, and the monster was not far behind. He looked terrified as his hands clasped both sides of his face to cover his ears. Just like before, how vivid are your nightmares? She knew he needed help, a shoulder and certainly a therapist, but she knew already he would never see one. All she can do is listen and offer a shoulder. Any more would undo all the work she and Sam accomplished with him. She walked towards him, maintaining eye contact with him, but his eyes didn't seem to react to her presence as the temperature continued to drop, seeing the white mist of her breath. She took each step with care, knowing full well her condition, albeit maybe not as severe yet, but one can never be too careful. Her heart felt some strain on it, but not because of her condition, but merely because it hurt her inside to see anyone like this. Ted, it is good you stayed. This was what worried me. She took another step beside him and leaned against the wall with him. She wrapped her arm around his shoulders and leaned into him. He jerked away as he stared into her eyes as if he didn't know her. She moved in front of him and placed her hands on his wrists, ever so gently, and removed his hands away from his ears. She cried tears with him, and they streamed off her face and into his lap as the strings of her heart were pulled. I'm not a therapist, God help me. Ted, I can't hear what you hear. I can't see what you're seeing right now. She spoke softly as his hands dropped to her wrists. I know you don't want to talk about it, and I'm not going to force you to, but at some point you will need to talk about it, or you'll explode. I'm here when you want to talk about it. She moved to the side of him and leaned into him again and wrapped the blanket around them. He started to take deep breaths as he wiped the tears from his eyes with his fists again, turning them in his eye sockets. "Why?" he breathed. "Why?" she replied, turning her face to his. "Why are you and Sam so focused on me? I am filled with regret and guilt. I try so hard to function in the real world, but I just can't. These nightmares and phantoms simply won't let me. My nightmares don't end when I wake up. Every night when I try to sleep, I wake up screaming because I see ghosts. These ghosts are people I've killed. I remember their faces, every single one of them. I see those who I fought with and fought for. They're all dead because of me. I couldn't save them. I can't save anyone. I couldn't save any of them because I just couldn't muster the strength in me to kill anyone anymore. I couldn't save anyone. Perhaps they were all right, and there really isn't a point in a life like mine." She nodded. "You may feel that way. It is human to believe in the sanctity of life, and while there are those that like to undermine it by defining life on their own terms, the truth remains the same. We all value life, and when we take it away, we feel guilt and regret. We are told to value life at a young age, or at least I'd like to think so, and taking that life is enough to break us. Ted, even when we are not the one taking something away, we feel heartbroken by it. You remind me of my uncle. He came back from wartime, and he never expressed himself openly like you, and eventually took his own life. I don't want to see that happen to you." She watched these veins on his body, shimmering the light on the ceiling and on her flesh. Despite the dropping temperature, the veins, as they touched her, were like a frying pan. What is this? God, what happened to him that made him like this? Surely he wasn't born like this, was he? Life can be hard, and like I said to you on Independence Day, life can be hell. It's like that for everyone. We go through rough patches, and sometimes we feel like the light at the end of the tunnel is nothing more than where the last traveller fell, and what is left of his hope is burning in a lamp, stationary in a dead end. And sometimes we get to dance in the meadows and see the fireworks," she continued. The light from these veins started fading and was cooling down as the air around them warmed up. She didn't understand what was going on or what exactly these veins were doing. Even Ted admitted he didn't know what these were, but that he was the only one who ever had them. She felt his body cease trembling, thinking he reached some level of homeostasis. She continued, "It is no mistake to say I've become fond of you, even if I seem to know next to nothing about you. I know where you're from, and that's about it. I know you served to protect our nation, and that whatever happened to you there is unforgivable, whatever it was. It sounds like what you went through was nothing short of betrayal and regret." She was right. She knew nothing about him, but was able to ascertain that much, that everything that happened to him should never have happened to begin with. Could he trust her? "Ted, do you trust me with your heart? I will never say anything to anyone that you don't want spoken aloud. But do you trust me?" "No," he hesitated. "I don't trust you." He paused as he looked at her again. "But I am willing to try." "That is enough."